Yeah, good evening, everyone. Just going to give a minute for people to join. Can you see my screen, Patty? Yeah?
Now again, yep.
Okay. Maybe some poll questions. Right. A few more people joining. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight's webinar with myself, Lee Tester, and Dr. Paddy Ann Jones from Tier 3. Just some housekeeping. There is one CE credit that will be awarded for attending the whole webinar tonight. I think that will come into your email within the sort of next 5 to 10 business days, maybe sooner. Um, and if you have any questions, there is a question section that we'll probably have towards the end when we're both finished. Um, and I will pass over the control to Dr. Patty Ann to start this evening's webinar.
Okay. So do I actually have control in switching the slides, or I think that's you, right? I think that's you.
You
Do you?
it might be me, but
I think.
you can ask for remote. You can
Okay.
ask for control if you want. It might work. But if it
Uh,
doesn't, I'll do it. Then you
I
just
don't want
tell
to
me.
hold it up, but I think. Sorry, you maybe you have to give me control.
Okay, hold on.
Sorry,
Uh,
everybody.
okay, I'm giving you control now. See if that works. It's- okay, you're controlling now.
All right. Okay. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I might give you a 5-second bio. I'm Patty Ann Jones. I'm a retired dentist. I practiced for about 25 years in both Ontario and BC as both a practice owner and an associate. Along the way, I picked up an MBA from the Richard Ivey School of Business. So, alongside my clinical career, I also held a number of other industry roles. For the last 6 years, I've been with Tier 3 brokerage as a sales representative and transition consultant, helping dentists with practice appraisals and sales, and also advising them on how to improve their practices. So these are the topics I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to cover the first half, and then Lee's going to cover the second half, and then we'll have questions at the end. So I'll give you a quick update on the state of the market. I'll cover a bit about how practices are valued, opportunities for increasing value, practice value, and then also touch on a few other factors that impact your practice value and ability to sell your practice. Sorry, it's a little bit touchy. There we go. Oh, jeez. I think there's a delay. That's what it is.
Yeah, there is a delay.
So, for those of you who aren't familiar with Tier 3 brokerage, we're one of Canada's leading dental practice brokerages. So, our business is practice appraisals and sales and advisory. So, we're a national brokerage with sales reps from coast to coast. Since 2021, we've been part of the Henry Schein um, family, which has been great for us because it's allowed us to bring even more buyers to the table and also offer additional value-added services for our clients. There are a couple of things that really set our appraisals apart from those of other brokerages. One is our appraisals are very data driven. So there's a heavy focus on cash flow, which accountants and bankers really like. And it means we rarely run into issues in due diligence. And then we also have a proprietary advanced patient metrics, which allows us to do the most in-depth analysis on the patient base more than any other brokerage. So I'll kind of give you a brief market update. We all know that there's a lot of economic uncertainty out there. So what is the market doing? DSOs are still paying 7.5 to 8.5 times earnings, and individual buyers, although some are a bit gun shy and sitting on the sidelines, there's still a lot of buyers in the marketplace looking to buy, and they're paying 5.5 to 6.5 times earnings. Banks are being a bit more cautious. They're still loaning at prime minus a quarter, amortized over 12 years, usually with interest only for the first year, but they're being a little bit more conservative with their debt service coverage ratios, which means they require a little bit more of a cash flow cushion to ensure that the buyer can make their loan payments. We're still seeing strong demand for quality practices. The practices that are suffering are those that have issues like lease issues, which we'll talk about later, maybe really old equipment or declining trends. So there's this flight towards quality. So we're seeing when there's economic uncertainty, buyers are shying away from practices with risk and gravitating more towards quality practices with more certainty. So the question really is what makes a quality practice, and does your practice fit into that category? So what are buyers looking for? They're looking for established, sustainable cash flows so they can pay down their bank loan and support their lifestyle. Positive practice trends, so a practice that's growing or is stable, not one that's declining. Strong new patient flow to promote growth and also to compensate for the more than compensate for the natural attrition in the practice. A robust hygiene program. Buyers love a great hygiene program because it's quite a profitable revenue stream, and it's a reliable, sustainable revenue stream that they can count on going forward. Opportunities for growth. So is there an opportunity to bring additional services in-house or maybe remove capacity constraints that could unlock some additional potential? Occupancy is huge. So if it's a leased space, they're looking for a favorable lease with sufficient tenancy length and no clauses in there that would put that tenancy in jeopardy. And if there's the opportunity to buy the real estate along with the practice, they love that because it puts them in control of their own tenancy. Also, an attractive location and a well-maintained facility. So is this a facility that's had regular updates to the leaseholds and the equipment over the years, or is it a practice that was opened 40 years ago and nothing's been done to it throughout that period? Modern technology, most buyers are expecting to see digital charting, digital x-rays, intraoral scanner, and sometimes even a digital pan. And if those things aren't there, then they are taking the cost of those items into account when they're determining what price they're going to offer for a practice. And then vendor transition. Is this a vendor that's willing to stay on, be supportive, work in the practice for 6 to 12 months after close or even longer to help transition the patients and the staff? So if you're interested in how your practice is doing and you want to maybe look for opportunities for improvement, then a practice appraisal is a great idea. Contrary to what most people think, or a lot of people think, it's not just a number. It's really a deep dive into all aspects of your practice economics, your patient base, your business practices, to see what the practice is doing well and where there may be opportunities to unlock additional potential and value. It also establishes a baseline for comparison. So if you praise your practice now and then you work on some improvements, then in 2-3 years you can update that appraisal to see what you've achieved and see where there may be some additional opportunities for you to work on. An appraisal also involves a preliminary lease review and review of the staff contracts, just to identify factors in the lease and contracts that could impact your practice value and make it challenging to sell your practice. It also highlights trends which really matter to buyers, like trends in your patient base, trends in your practice economics. And so an appraisal is beneficial at all stages of ownership for the purposes of continuous improvement. And that's why we actually have an appraisal product that's a little bit less expensive than a full appraisal that is specifically designed for planning purposes. If you're looking to sell your practice, you will need a practice appraisal because a buyer's bank will require that in order to fund the purchase. And ideally, that appraisal happens about 5 years before you're looking to sell, just so that you have time to work on improving the value of the practice. And also you can fix any issues with or work on fixing any issues with your lease and your contracts, and make sure you're set up to use your capital gains exemption. So practice in general, practices are valued based on a multiple of adjusted earnings. That earnings being EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But EBITDA is not the same as income. And so I have an example up here on the left. You can see just a general, I wonder if I can put it, just a general income statement with what you would see from your accountant, your professional fees at the top. We break those out into different revenue streams based on production reports. And then you have all your standard expenses here, and then your income before taxes at the bottom. When we calculate EBITDA, it involves a number of adjustments. So we remove any personal or discretionary expenses. We remove any costs that are more associated with you being a dentist than the business. For example, travel, meals and entertainment, CE, automobile, fees, memberships, dues. Then we also remove any non-cash expenses like amortization, the cost of financing, which is specific to the vendor. And then we build in a market compensation for the dentistry, all of the dentistry. So you can see that down here, we've built in a market compensation of 40% on all the dentistry. So we're valuing the business. And the business needs to compensate all of its employees and all of its contractors. And the owner is a contractor in the business. So we treat the owner as an associate in their own practice. And so we compensate 40% on all of the dentistry. And so when you hear of earnings, the earnings that is typically referred to in the marketplace is earnings after doctor's compensation. So that adjusted EBITDA, that's basically the cash flow that's coming out of the business that's available to pay taxes, for a buyer to pay down their bank loan, for the owner to further fund their lifestyle, or maybe for capital reinvestment for buying new equipment, for example. But when I say that practices are in general valued based on a multiple of earnings, that's a little bit of an oversimplified statement, because when we value practices, we actually model out a business for 10 years. So we're forward looking, and we're anticipating the earnings that would be generated in the hands of the average buyer, which allows us to make different adjustments. So for example, if we see a lot of potential in the practice, we may build some of that potential into the value through an upward revenue adjustment. Or if we think that a buyer would be able to achieve some cost savings, we may build those into the value calculation. But we also go the other way. So if we say we see a practice where the patient base is declining, we may build in some additional advertising and marketing costs, just because we assume that a buyer would need that in order to stabilize the patient base. We also build in risk. So risk is indirectly built into the value calculation. And an example of that is dentists will also often say to us, well, if my practice is going to be valued based on a multiple of earnings, and I have new equipment, is my practice then going to be valued at the same level as a practice with the same earnings but really old equipment? And no, it would not, because that old equipment is risk to the buyer of the need to have to replace that equipment in the near term. So that is built into the practice value through the discounted cash flow, the discount rate, and the discounted cash flow. It ultimately leads to a discount to the value to free up cash flow for that buyer to purchase new equipment. So what's important to remember is that that earnings is very powerful because any change in the earnings is magnified in your practice value. So if you are able to increase your practice earnings by $10,000, then at a 6x earnings multiple, that would lead to an increase in practice value of $60,000. So if you're interested in improving your practice, seeing how your practice is doing, if you want to look for opportunities to increase the earnings and build value through a practice appraisal, we meet with clients to go over the specific opportunities in their practice. But I have some points here, some general points for different strategies you can use to boost the value in your practice. One is grow your patient base because that's where the revenue comes from. The trend in the patient base is really a result of the balance between new patient flow and attrition and delinquency. So if you have more new patients coming to the practice than patients that are leaving the practice, then you're going to see a positive trend in the patient base. So to promote the most growth, you'd want to focus on increasing the new patient flow and reducing the patient attrition and delinquency. You could also expand the scope of services offered in the practice, and that would increase the revenue. That could be either if you're an owner that's interested in expanding your personal scope through CE, that would be an option. Or if you're not comfortable with that, it could mean bringing in an associate with a complementary skill set, or maybe even bringing specialists in-house to keep more procedures in the office. Eliminating capacity constraints to fully realize your practice potential. So sometimes we'll see practices that are just booked out so far in advance, especially their hygiene department, and it's just tough for them to get patients in. Well, if that practice was able to expand the provider hours, that would remove that bottleneck and unlock some additional potential in that practice. Another opportunity is to integrate modern technology into the practice. It can help the office work more productively, efficiently, and even enhance patient care. Dentistry is really moving towards a digital workflow, but AI is finding its way. That's the new and interesting thing. It's finding its way into all parts of the dental office. There are AI receptionists that can answer the phones and book patients in real time 24/7. They can check the insurance eligibility, answer specific questions the patients have over the phone. There's AI assisted tools for documentation, recording perio measurements that can summarize conversations with patients and document them in the chart. And then, of course, we've all seen the AI assisted tools for diagnosing images, radiographs, and it can act as an adjunct to clinical diagnosis by a dentist, but it also displays pathology really clearly on the screen, which helps with patient education and could maybe even lead to greater case acceptance. You can optimize the hygiene program. We really do a deep dive into the hygiene program when we do an appraisal, and we often find in most practices that there is potential within the existing patient base, even without any growth. And then in general, you can just work on working more efficiently and reducing costs. If you do a lot of crown and bridge in your practice and you have a large commercial lab bill annually, lab costs annually, then an option may be to bring in a CEREC machine or a 3D printer to keep some of those lab procedures in-house. Or in general, you could look at really focus on the big costs in the dental practice and reducing those, such as wage costs or supply costs. So I'll touch on just three things, additional factors that can, sorry, there's this delay. There we go. Touch on a few other factors that can impact your practice value and saleability. One is your staff contracts. Staff contracts are important to any practice owner because they reduce your termination risk. And they're important when it comes to sale because it reduces the termination risk for a buyer. So it makes the practice more attractive. There have been some recent changes in employment law that have rendered a majority of the termination provisions unenforceable in staff contracts. So if you haven't updated your contracts in the last 3 to 5 years, I suggest you give your employment lawyer a call just to see if your contracts need some revisions, just to make sure that you're protected. So without contracts or enforceable termination provisions, your termination risk goes up. And the reason for that is because those termination provisions limit the employee's termination pay or notice to that's required under the Employment Standards Act, which is 1 week per year of service to a maximum of 8 weeks. If your contracts are no longer enforceable, then that termination risk goes up. The employees are then entitled to common law termination rights that could be up to a month of pay or notice per year of service for a maximum of 2 years. When it comes to a sale, if you don't have contracts or enforceable contracts, it's not the end of the world. It's usually dealt with in the purchase agreement with the buyer and the seller sharing the termination costs for the first 3 months. But I can tell you that with these changes in employment law, buyers and their lawyers are becoming more sensitive of this issue and more critical of the staff contracts, which has posed some problems for us in recent sales. When it comes to associate contracts, that's another matter. It's imperative that you have an associate contract in place when you go to sell. The reason for that is because buyers are mainly buying your patient base, and if there's a chance an associate could leave and take a bunch of the patient base with them, then a buyer is unlikely to take on that risk and pay for the patients. Come on. Sorry, no, it's not advancing at all. Uh, okay, whoops. Okay, here we go. So this is about the capital gains exemption. Most practices sell in a share sale, so the vendor can use their lifetime capital gains exemption, which is 1.25 million. And often they'll use the capital gains exemptions for their family members too, their spouse, their kids, their parents. However, in order to do that, it requires advanced planning because there are rules that limit the value of the passive assets that you can have in your corporation for the 24 months before you sell. So it's important that you have an experienced dental accountant and you keep them apprised of your sale timeline so that they can ensure that your corporation has been purified and that you're eligible to use your capital gains exemption when you sell, because it will save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax. All right, and here we go. So this is going to lead into Lee's talk. Your premises lease. The most common issues we've run into with sales have to do with the lease. The devil is in the details. They're long, complicated legal documents that dentists are just not trained to read, and they miss things. So it's important that when you negotiate with the landlord, that you have somebody on your side with expertise like Lee to help you with that, to make sure you're adequately protected and that your lease is set up in a favorable position to go to market. Lease issues can have a meaningful impact on your practice value and the ability to sell your practice. Just a heads up that a buyer will require a minimum of 12 years of tenancy certainty to buy your practice. And that's because their bank loan will be amortized over 12 years. So their banker will require that minimum 12 years of tenancy certainty to ensure that the buyer can practice there for 12 years to generate the cash flow to make their loan payments. And also, don't miss your option to renew. If you do, you're at the mercy of the landlord. I can think of one recent case where a client missed that expiry date, that notice expiry date, and had to enter into a new lease with double the base rent. The most common issues we run into with leases when it comes to practice sales are a lack of tenancy length, unfavorable assignment clauses, poorly worded relocation clauses, and the worst is a demolition clause. Now, I know demolition clauses are becoming more prevalent, especially in urban areas, but avoid if you can at all possible, avoid having a demolition clause in your lease. If you have no choice, then try to push that demolition clause out as far as you can. The reason it impacts your value is because the potential cost of relocating gets basically is taken right off the value of your practice. And that could be if you have a 1,500 square foot office, and then you multiply that by 200 or 275 or $300 per square foot to build new leaseholds. And that means your practice value could be impacted by $400,000 or $500,000 or more. The further out you can defer that demolition clause, the less impact it will have on your practice value, because that cost is further into the future, and the less problematic would be in a sale, because the less concern it would be for a buyer the further out that demolition clause is deferred. So I will let Lee, then I'll pass it over to Lee so he can expand on those issues in more detail. Oh, Lee, I can't hear you. Oh, you're muted, Lee.
What about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. I'm just going to put a couple of poll questions. If you could just take a minute before we start, just to answer some of the questions before I kind of get into my slides. It'll just give me an idea of if you lease or of your own, kind of best describe your situation. So those of you that are participating into the into tonight's webinar, that would be super helpful. Um, I'll just give everybody a minute or two. It just gives us an idea if you're looking to start a practice, buy a practice, if you actually, currently in a lease, you own or you don't own. Um, it's really helpful for me. So while you're doing that, let me introduce myself. So my name's Lee Tesler. I'm the senior consultant here at Cirrus Consulting Group. I've been at Cirrus for over 8 years now. Originally from the UK, you can probably tell from my accent. I was always in kind of consulting in wealth management before moving to Toronto probably about 13 years ago now. Um, and Cirrus, so who are we and how have we been representing the dental community successfully for over 30 years now? So essentially, we're a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm founded by a couple of doctors actually over 30 years ago in Western Canada, as landlords were taking advantage of the healthcare tenant. As some of you maybe already know, or some of you will find out, it can be an expensive business to enter into, um, but it's extremely profitable business as well. So since inception, we've probably negotiated over 10,000 dental specific leases. We do other healthcare professionals, veterinarians, um, general practitioners. I would say majority of clients are dentists, and I lecture across the country giving continuing education, seminars on the business side of dentistry, and lecture some of the big dental conferences. I know that Patty Ann was lecturing at the PDC recently. So you will probably find us in one of those conferences or on a webinar throughout the year. So we'll, Cirrus, we also get access to some proprietary data where, we can have a little bit of a deep dive into, the market in terms of current rental rates and vacancies, depending on where you are. Now, obviously, that's a little bit more specific to your particular building or location. Just to give you an example, the current market rates in Vancouver, in Toronto, I mean, even when vacancy rates started to go up during COVID, rental rates were still increasing, and landlords still have that control as much as yes, you are certainly one of the best tenants on the planet, but they in some cases, if the space is not filled up for a while, then so be it. But that doesn't mean it's not negotiable because everything is negotiable in that regard. And like I said, if you're interested in a consultation, if you're looking at a particular space or a practice to take over, we can have a look to see when that building location or building was built, what year, what are the vacancy rates, how long it would be on market if it actually was vacant. So we can definitely have a little bit more of a deep dive into that. So what is a lease? I mean, it's actually one question I like to actually ask at most of my webinars or seminars. What is a lease? Now, normally, if I'm in person, I might get some interaction. So here I'm going to just tell you, essentially, it's a check, and it's probably one of the largest checks that you're going to write in your professional career, outside of maybe a residential purchase. And the reason I say that is now, unless you buy the building, like Patty Ann said earlier, I mean, there's different cash flow uh, from that perspective. But if you are, starting a practice and you're leasing, just on average, even if you're looking at $5,000 per month over sort of 20, 30 years, because the average dentist will stay in the same space for 26 years, I think it is. So you're looking at around $2 million plus of tenancy expenses that you're going to pay over that period of time. So that's why, there is obviously more to a lease than just the dollar value, as we will touch on as we go through tonight's presentation. But I do want you to make you aware that, that there is a big investment you're making, and it's important that the lease is structured correctly. And you certainly are a better tenant than maybe a restaurant or a nail salon. You can't just pick up on the weekend like an attorney or an accountant. Um, as we were saying earlier, there's equipment, there's a lot of value in the practice, and it's not just time consuming, but very expensive to move as well. So like Patty Ann was saying earlier, there are certain questions and certain things that, again, I don't expect to make you experts tonight, but if you are in a lease, when does that lease expire? Make sure you know some of the critical dates, the option. If you do have some options, is there a notice period of when you actually have to give permission that you want to exercise that option? Are you personally liable? What happens when it comes to selling? We touched on some of the demolition and relocation, but these are just some of the things just to bear in mind. And again, we can certainly have a bit more of a deeper dive when it comes to that. So, how to look at your lease differently? Now, majority of people will look at the first page and they'll look to see what they're paying and for how long they're paying for. And, the other 40 pages of the lease, they'll probably put in the drawer until, comes 10 years or 20 years later when it comes to renew. And in some cases, I don't blame you. But the other 40 pages are extremely important in terms of why we want to have a well-structured lease and how we look at it differently. So providing fair and affordable financial terms, really as simple as it says, like, are you paying in line with market rents? Now, you may pay a small premium for a dental practice or a dental clinic, but is the rent in line with market? Is the escalations, are they going up with inflation? want to make sure that at least that you're paying fair market rents. Now, long-term stability and security, again, we want to have control of the asset. Like Paddy Ann said earlier, having control of that asset is extremely important, right? Even if you don't want to stay in the same space for 30 years, you still want to have the flexibility and that control that you are going to be there if you want to be. Minimize risk and exposure. So a lot of you maybe that look to take over a practice or acquire a practice. Um, you may well have to sign some sort of personal guarantee, which is quite normal. You just don't want to be on the hook forever and ever when it comes to limiting certain liability. Maximizing flexibility. So, is there, as the practice grows, is there a right of first refusal on an adjacent space if you want to expand? Is there a right of first refusal to actually purchase the building? Some of these things, just having them in the lease adds value to the practice. You would hate to think you're in a great location and suddenly you're at capacity and you'd love to expand, and then the space beside you becomes available and somebody else leases it out before you even get a look in. So, just adding some of those things to the lease just again maximizes your flexibility. And then lastly, enhancing your ability to eventually sell the practice. Um, like Patty Ann said, the key to selling the practice is the assignment language because you have to get permission from the landlord, excuse me, to assign the lease. So the language is really critical at this point in terms of we touched on some of the term that you have, but we've seen scenarios where, landlord will say, you've been at my building, you've been in my location for 30 years, and they want a percentage of the proceeds of sale. And I kid you not, because I've seen it in my own eyes where we had a client that was selling their practice and three times it fell through. And then the third, because the landlord wanted a percentage of the proceeds of sale. This was a $2 million practice. In the end, the seller actually cut a check for $263,000 because they were like done yesterday. They wanted to sell and get out, so they took the 1.7 million or whatever it was just to get the landlord to assign the lease. Sorry, it's going as quick as you were. Um, so there are sort of, like I said, I'm not going to go through for the interest of time. There's 20, 25 other provisions that we certainly want to keep an eye on. The demolition clause, as Patty Ann said earlier, is a key component, and it is much more common in leases. Doesn't mean you can't sell the practice. That there are certain um, things that we could do to try and improve the language if there is a demolition that the landlord, will not remove. Um, so we will touch on and give you an example of some of the assignment language as we go on. Um, One slide I just wanted to touch on because I know that a lot of people are sometimes unsure about, buying the building versus leasing. Again, there's pros and cons. Um, if you are looking to buy the building up front when you acquire a practice, obviously there's a large investment, financial investment. Some people may not be able to, buy the building and the practice straight away. Again, that's why if you're selling, if you're the seller and you have something in your lease that gives the buyer the first right of refusal to buy the building, then maybe they'll do that in the future. But if they can, buy everything up front in the building, then they become the landlord. They certainly have greater flexibility on how to use the space and freedom of control because they're the landlord. Um, Now, if they lease, then there's a smaller upfront payment, greater working capital towards the practice itself. And if for whatever reason the location or the area becomes a little bit changes over a period of time, then obviously they don't have to stay and they have the flexibility to relocate. The common denominator here is even if you do buy or lease, you still need a lease that would separate the building from the practice corp. And the simplest way to explain that is if you own a building and you own the practice and you're looking to sell your practice and you want to keep the real estate, you're going to still need a lease to present to any buyer if they're going to get finance. And at that stage, you suddenly become the landlord. So you're going to have to you're going to want to have something in writing to um, in terms of some of the conditions and consent that you want now, because suddenly you have to put your landlord hat on. So we would still help create that lease. We have plenty of clients that own buildings and own practices that we created a lease for. Obviously, it's a slightly easier process, let's say, because we're not negotiating with the landlord, but it certainly can add value to the practice itself if you have a lease, because it shows a history of rental payments. It's not something that you've just pulled off the internet like the day before. Um, so what makes up the value of the practice? Like Patian was saying, right? Your equipment, again, depending on if it's new, if it's old, your goodwill, and the lease. The lease is one of the key components. Now you can sell your goodwill, you can sell your equipment. Um, if for whatever reason there's a problem with the lease, which we obviously we want to avoid, but the key component here is if you're just selling equipment and goodwill, somebody is going to have to take that and put it somewhere else. It's essentially could cost them $500,000 to build out another space, another practice. So that's why the lease is such a key component when it comes to, the value of your practice and selling a practice. Now, I wanted to just talk about the assignment clause. Um, Now, the assignment clause essentially is some language in the lease that allows you to transfer the lease to another person or party, essentially, uh, normally in conjunction with the sale or acquisition of the practice. Now, again, we'll give you an example of what a kind of standard assignment clause looks like and what some of the red flags we find. And hopefully, if we're involved, at least 5 years or so or more before that transition takes place, then we can certainly help a more seamless sale of the practice. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of reading to do. Um, Well, I just take a sip of drink. So this is an assignment clause. Again, this is found in 75% of leases that we look at. Um, there's a number of red flags just in this provision itself, which I'm going to touch on. So have a quick look at that, and then I'll go through that. Okay, so just wait for my mouse. Oh, right. Sometimes it just goes through individually. Um, This one is just highlighted all the red flags. So I don't know if any of you saw that, but I'm going to just talk about some of them. So if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it first has to have receive written consent from the landlord. Receive consent. Now, again, this is pretty standard. You have to get permission from the landlord to transfer the lease. Now, problems come as we read a little bit further. So the second paragraph or sentence, essentially the landlord has three options in this scenario. One, simply just to approve the tenant's request. Two, it can actually just decline the tenant's request. And three, can terminate the lease agreement just for you asking for permission to assign the lease, which is what we refer to as termination language. So three options right there. Landlord suddenly says, for whatever reason, whatever conditions, doesn't approve the transfer, then you're in trouble. Again, maybe you sell your equipment and you sell your goodwill, but we want to make sure that the language is allows you to sell to an accredited dental practitioner. Um, Unfortunately, some of the language in this provision does actually get worse. Now, the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent paid during the remainder of the term greater than the current market rent for the leased premises or 15% greater than the current rent. So essentially, what this language is saying is, okay, landlord says, okay, I have no problem approving the transfer, but the new buyer is going to pay 15% more on rents. Now, what's that going to do to the valuation of your practice? Because if I'm the buyer and suddenly I'm going to have to pay 15%, then I'm going to probably drop my asking price by 15%. And as we said, furthermore, should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash goods, any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of the lease that is above current base rental rates to landlord in any fiscal year during the term of the lease, the difference between the annual rate, any such rental income, cash goods, consideration shall be paid directly to the landlord within 30 days. So, like I said, if your annual rent is 100 grand a year and you suddenly get a check for $1 million, landlord essentially here is asking for $900,000 of your blood, sweat, and tears, which is ridiculous and crazy. And that's something certainly we don't want. But again, I've seen it before, and that's why we put in a lot of these preventative measures to try to, when it comes to selling the practice, that the lease is in structured and in good shape. And then the last paragraph, you've you've got approval, you haven't had to pay landlord hopefully any percentage of sale proceeds, and then it says that the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease, shall remain liable for any failure of future tenants or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So this is something that we refer to as continuing liability. Now, again, ideally, you want to sell the practice, ride off into the sunset, be off, and not be liable for the lease going forward. Now, again, in some cases, the landlord, you may sell to a young associate that's got a lot of debt that they don't know. In some cases, they want you to guarantee the lease for a period of time. Now, again, best case scenario, you're completely removed from any liability and you don't have to worry about it. In some cases, they may ask, they may want 1 or 2 years, but you just don't want to be on the hook forever and ever, right? Because we had a client that sold his practice. Unfortunately, didn't have us involved until afterwards, but they sold their practice in 2019, just a year before COVID. Young associate took over the practice. 3 years into the practice ownership, unfortunately, took on too much debt, COVID, etc. And they were after 3 years of a 10-year lease, there was 3 months of arrears of rent. They owed about $20,000, and landlord phoned up the selling dentist who had now retired to say, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you owe $20,000 and there's still 7 years left on the lease. The last thing that this doctor wants to do is come out of retirement. Um, So, what is the cost of this mistake? I mean, anywhere from sort of 250,000 to 750,000 liability, inability to sell the practice, having to absorb a significant increase in rent, remaining liable as a guarantor beyond the practice sale, or even having to pay the landlord a portion of your sale proceeds. So this is a really critical provision, especially when you're looking to sell your practice in the future. Um, this was one slide that I like to add to my presentations. I actually got it from one of my colleagues who used to work on the landlord side. Patty Ann touched on this earlier. So we recommend really if you're in a lease, um, if you're a current practice owner and maybe you've got a renewal coming up, we recommend to start that process around 2 years before expiry. And the reason for that is just purely from a leverage standpoint, because a landlord ne necessarily won't, most of them won't tell you when that date is coming. Some might, give you a warning, but normally they want to get you down to the sort of 12, 8 month, 6 months before expiry. And if your option's coming up for um, expiry, and one, if you miss that, obviously they gain a lot of control. But the longer it gets to closer it gets to the expiration date, the less likely even if you wanted to move, you're probably not going to be able to find another practice and move within that sort of period of time. So again, just having an idea of some of the critical dates within a lease is extremely important. So why have Cirrus? Why have we been, partners with Henry Schein, with Tier 3, with, successfully winning lease negotiations and strategies for a period of time? Um, Really, because we found a formula that works. We do everything in-house. We have a team of lease negotiators, some comprised of real estate attorneys, some former real estate brokers, and some that actually have, like I said, represented the landlord side. And then, so we do all the financial and all the legal negotiations in-house. So what we do to start with, gather all the information, just to have an understanding of where you're at. Even if you're looking to acquire a practice, you found one, what does that lease look like? What stage of your career are you at? We want to identify your practice and your career goals, right? We want to understand a little bit more about you, for the bigger picture to understand what we make sure that the lease is aligned to your future and your goals. So we would review the office lease for any risks. So if you're acquiring a practice, and you want to know what you're getting into, we review that. If you've got an existing lease and you're looking to sell, you want to make sure you know what the risks are. Um, we prepare some of our market research. As I said earlier, we'll look at the landlord, we'll look at the current location, we'll look at the rental rates, vacancies, just to understand who we're dealing with. Um, and then we'll develop a strategy for the negotiation. And all of that, five um, five pieces that we've done at this stage, we haven't even reached out to the landlord. Now, I know a lot of you, or a lot of people I speak to, and that I don't want you to get your lease out tonight and phone up your landlord and say, have I got this demolition? Have I got you're going to take proceeds of sale? Like that's not the case, and that's certainly not advisable. Um, because first of all, we want to be a bit more strategic than that. But again, it's just knowing what's in your lease. So we do all these things before we even reach out to the landlord, so that again, we're remunerated directly by you. We don't derive any commission if we're retained by one of our clients. So it's really about educating the landlord. I mean, a lot of what we ask for. I know somebody's raised their hand. We will have some time for questions in a minute. Um, it's really just about educating the landlord to say, look, you've got a great tenant who's want to be there for the next 10, 20 years. And, you know, there's certain things as a dental tenant that is different from your other tenants that need to be in the lease. That's not necessarily going to cost the landlord a huge amount of money. So we negotiate the lease, the economic terms, the financial terms, and the legal provisions, and then we do a final review and execution of the lease before submitting that. We are offering a complimentary lease consultation or consultation if you don't have a lease or you're looking to acquire a practice, or if you want to have a consultation with Patty Ann. Again, it's a complimentary consultation. It's on a first come, first served basis. Um, and I would strongly encourage you to take that up. Uh, I'm going to hold on. I'm going to just think I've got another poll for an exit poll. Um, I don't know. Have you got one? Hold on. So we've got some questions here. So I'm going to do some questions while I put the poll up. First one is for you, Patty Ann. I don't know if you can see these or not.
No, I can't see them.
Okay, so I'm going to read it out. So typical EBITDA margin for a good practice.
So average is about 22%. That's after doctor's compensation. So after he's built in the 40%.
Okay. And then the next question, it seems to be a lot for you. How much does Henry Shine charge to advise for the sale of the practice? You might
Uh,
not.
so ad- so if you're looking to sell your practice, the no, so we'll do an appraisal, and a lot of the advisory would be associated with the appraisal, and the cost of the appraisals vary depending on the size of the practice. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, I would strongly suggest that, again, speak to Patty Ann after, or if you want to have a consultation or a conversation, she can go into a little bit more detail. I have just put an exit poll on the screen. Those of you that are still here and want your C credits, again, if you can just fill that out, that's really helpful for us in terms of your situation and if you do want some sort of consultation. Couple more questions for you while we still have some time. Seem to be all for you, Patty Ann. Um, well, you said here it's similar kind of how much are appraisals, mini appraisals. I don't know if you want to,
Yeah,
that's a
so
similar answer to before.
we have different types of appraisals. So I would encourage anybody who to just give me a call or send me an email, and we could set up a time to chat. I'm happy to go over that.
Perfect. Question number 4 here is how much should advertising be as a percentage of total revenue?
So there's no definitive answer. We often look at an average of about 1.5% of revenue for advertising and marketing. But I know that I recently heard you can go to different marketing companies, but one that we know of that gets pretty good results indicated to us that after a, a preliminary period of time, it usually costs about $100 to $125 to acquire a new patient.
Okay,
So
and then
yeah.
last question for you, and then there is one for me. How do you determine the required rate of return in your appraisal?
So that's determined by the market. And we have a large database of a practice that have sold. And so we kind of look at what similar practices have sold for in that area. So that in general, that rate of return is determined, or the multiple is determined by the market.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for filling out the poll. There is a question for me here, so I'm going to just read it out and answer it. Um, Thanks, Sherwin Habibi. Are there advantages to signing a 10 to 12-year lease as opposed to sort of 2 5-year or 2 6-year? Um, I mean, again, it can depend on the specific, location. Um, I always tell clients personally, like if you're in a desirable location and a good a building somewhere where somebody will want to take over that lease, then as long as the assignment language, as we talked about, is solid, then again, no issue signing a 10 or 12-year lease. I wouldn't say that the huge advantage is obviously that you have a little bit more predictability. Some people still like to have the 5 plus 5, just in case they're not sure where they're going to be in 10 years. Um, I hope that's answered the question and I'm not rambling too much, but like I said, I don't think there's not a huge much difference in it. Some people again, I'm comfortable maybe not signing a 10-year and rather the 5 plus 5. Some people want to just know, look, they know they're going to be in that space, that location, and they want to know that they don't have to worry about the lease for the next 10, 12 years.
You know what, Lee, that's a really good question because um, we kind of see that as well. And so what do you think? Because if you're locked in for 10 years, we always find that if you have 2 5-year options rather than a 10-year term, then you have more opportunity to negotiate with a landlord. And if somebody has like a 10 year, so they have a 10-year term, then if they have to maintain that 12 years of tenancy in order to sell, even if they have a 10-year term and a 5-year option, then as they're approaching like even when they're not like even 6 years into their that 10-year term, the landlord's not going to negotiate at that point, and they're already below that, that 12 years of tenancy that they require. You know what I mean? Like
Y-
even when they're just maybe like 3, 4 years in.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I don't think, like I said, to have that, sometimes landlords, if you only want 5 years, you may only get a 5 year option, right?
Yeah.
If you give them 10 year term, you may get two 5 year options. You can't just I'll have a 3 year term, but I have 10 5 year options, right? It's a little bit of give and take with the
Yeah.
landlord, in that respect. I think it really just comes down to like the location, and where you're at
And
in
I know
in
you
that
can
respect.
you can likely achieve a lot more if you're giving in other areas of the lease if you give the landlord a 10-year term,
Yeah, and
right?
that's exactly
Yeah.
that as well. Like I think some people, not afraid, but like they're concerned. I don't want to sign for 10 years, but we've done 10 year leases, and I tell you we've fixed the rents for a period of time, and then they're coming up for renewal now. And believe me, they would the 10 year deal that we got them, they bite their hands off for it, now because we fixed the rents. They weren't going up so much, and now they're looking at a big increase. Do you have access? Can you put your contact details in the screen somewhere?
Sure.
Um, You should be as a panelist. If you can you click on the chat at the top? Or
Yeah.
yes. Can you put your
Um,
like email and your details? Because
yeah.
somebody's obviously asking for and then emails. I do appreciate that we are slightly over time. So I don't want to keep everybody. So that's Patty's email address, pattyann.jones@henryshine.ca. Any more questions before? Let me see. Okay, hold on. There's one more. If your assignment language is good, though, isn't a 10 year always superior to a 5+5? What advantage would the 5+5, assuming again assignment is favorable? Um, like if the assignment language is good and you have at least that 10, 12 years of term, like Patty Ann said, then then that's fine. 10 years is always going to be a little bit more superior for a buyer, right? But as long as you have that at least 12 years of runway, whether that's term or options, um, 10 years is going to be a little bit more favorable. I hope that answers your question. Um, any more questions before we let you all enjoy the rest of your evening? I think that we are good. So I'll just say thank you, everybody. Again, you've all got Patty's details and her phone number. And again, if anybody is interested in a complimentary consultation, I'm more than happy to schedule that. And I'm sure Patty Ann would be more than happy to take some questions and speak to you after in a bit more detail.
So
Um,
absolutely.
okay, thank you.
Thanks
Thanks everyone
everybody
for
for
joining.
joining. Thanks,
Thank
Lee.
you. Thank you, Patty. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Have a good
Bye.
night.
Good
Bye.
night, everyone.